You finish something, but it doesn't feel finished. So you go back to it, just for a second. Then you move on, start something else, and halfway through, your attention shifts again. Not enough to stop you, just enough that you're not fully in it anymore. So you keep going, but not at the same level you started. When you reach the end, it still doesn't feel complete. So your mind goes back, not to solve it, just to touch it again. And by the time you stop, you haven't really stopped.
It doesn't start in a way you can notice. There's no moment you can point to and say, this is when it began. You just move through the day the way you normally do. You finish something, and almost immediately, you're already in the next thing. No pause, no reset, just continuation. At first, it feels normal. You're still functioning, still responding, still getting through what needs to be done. But something shifts, quietly. You begin something simple, and for a moment, your attention is there. Then it slips. Not completely, just enough that part of you is no longer in what you're doing. So you continue. But now you're slightly split. One part of you moving forward, another part already somewhere else. You read something, and before you even realize it, you've already gone back to the beginning. You check something, then check it again. Not because you need to, but because it didn't fully land the first time. It's small, almost unnoticeable, but it repeats. You move from one thing to the next, but nothing feels like it fully ends. There's always something left behind, just enough to follow you into the next moment. And over time, that starts to stack. Not in a way that feels intense, but in a way that never clears. So even when things slow down, you don't feel like you've stopped. You pause, but your attention doesn't settle into the pause. It shifts, finds something else, keeps going. And that's when it starts to feel different. You're not overwhelmed. You're not under pressure. But something about your day feels heavier than it should. And when you try to explain it, there's nothing clear to point to. No single task, no obvious cause. Just a sense that your mind has been in motion the entire time, without ever fully landing anywhere. And that's the part most people miss. It's not what you're doing that's draining you. It's the fact that internally, nothing is ever fully stopping.
What's happening underneath all of this isn't random. It follows a pattern, a very specific one. Your mind starts something, a thought, a question, a small moment of reflection, and instead of reaching a clear endpoint, it stays open. Not fully active, but not dismissed either. It doesn't resolve. It doesn't close. It just lingers. And that unfinished state is easy to overlook because nothing about it feels urgent. It's quiet, subtle, but it's still active. and anything that isn't clearly finished doesn't get filed away. Your mind doesn't treat it as complete. It treats it as pending. So instead of moving on cleanly, your attention keeps drifting back to it. Not always in obvious ways. Sometimes it's the exact same thought, returning in the same form. But more often, it comes back slightly changed. A different angle, a new interpretation, a slightly adjusted version of the same underlying idea. And because it looks different, it feels new. But it's not. Underneath, it's still connected to the original starting point. And your mind recognizes that connection, even if you don't consciously notice it. That's why it keeps reopening it. Not because it's important right now, but because internally, it was never marked as finished. This is how mental loops begin. Not from intensity, not from overthinking in the way people usually describe it, but from lack of closure, from processes that were started but never clearly ended. And once a loop like that becomes active, it doesn't need a strong trigger to come back. It doesn't need something dramatic to bring it to the surface. It runs quietly in the background, waiting for something small, a pause in your day, a moment between tasks, a gap where your attention isn't fully occupied. And the moment that gap appears, it steps back in. Automatically. Seamlessly. Almost like it was already there, just waiting for space. That's why it can feel like your thoughts come out of nowhere. Like something just appeared without any clear cause. But it's not coming from nowhere. It's coming from something that never fully left. Something that stayed open, just beneath the surface. And the more often it returns, the more familiar it becomes. Not clearer, not more accurate, just easier to access. Your mind doesn't have to search for it anymore. It already knows the path. So it starts going back to it with less effort each time, which makes the return feel faster, more automatic. And over time, that frequency begins to build, until eventually it doesn't feel like something that happens occasionally. It starts to feel like a default state, like your mind is always slightly engaged with something, even when nothing specific is happening. And that's where the exhaustion begins to deepen. Because it's not just about having thoughts, it's about never fully being between them. There's no clear reset point. No moment where everything settles and actually stays settled. Just a continuous cycle of partial thinking. Starting, returning, adjusting, repeating. And over time, that creates a kind of mental weight that's difficult to explain, because nothing in it feels intense enough to justify how tired you feel. But it's constant. And constant low-level activity drains you differently. It doesn't overwhelm you all at once. It wears you down gradually, quietly.
Until even simple moments of stillness don't feel like rest anymore. Because your mind doesn't interpret stillness as an end point, it interprets it as an opening, an opportunity to continue what was never finished. And here's the part that usually goes unnoticed. The loop
doesn't actually restart when the thought appears. It restarts the moment you begin to follow it again. And that happens so quickly, so automatically, that it rarely feels like a choice. It just feels like thinking. But that's why it's so easy to stay inside it, because nothing about it feels like a clear beginning or a clear end, just continuation. So as long as that process stays open, your mind keeps returning to it, not to move forward, but simply because it hasn't reached an end point yet.
At this point, it can feel like you're doing something productive. You're thinking, going over things, trying to make sense of something. And because your mind is active, it creates the impression that progress is happening. But activity and movement are not the same thing. You can be mentally active without actually moving forward. Because what feels like thinking is often just returning to the same point from a slightly different angle. The wording changes, the perspective shifts slightly, so it feels new for a moment. But underneath, the structure stays the same. So instead of reaching a new conclusion, you revisit the same one with minor variations. And that creates an illusion. It feels like you're getting closer when you're actually circling. And circling has a rhythm to it. It pulls your attention in, holds it for a moment, then releases it just enough to make you think you're done. But a short time later, it returns again, slightly different, slightly reworded, but connected.
So your mind engages again, believing there's something new to resolve. And that's where the cycle reinforces itself. Not because the thought is deep, but because it feels unfinished every time it appears. So each pass through it feels necessary, even when it's not leading anywhere. This is why it's difficult to notice in real time. From the inside, it feels like effort. It feels like you're working through something. But if you step back and look at it over time, you'll see a different pattern. The same starting point, the same direction, the same return. No clear endpoint, just repetition with slight variation. And because there's no clear endpoint, your mind never registers completion, which means it never fully disengages. So instead of closing the process, it keeps it open. And anything that stays open continues to draw attention. Not all at once, but in intervals. Small re-entries that feel like separate moments, but are actually connected. And over time, those intervals become more frequent. Not because something new is happening, but because nothing has been resolved. So your mind keeps allocating energy to again and again. And each time, it feels like a fresh attempt. But it's not a new attempt. It's the same process, restarting from the beginning. That's why it feels like you've been thinking all day without actually getting anywhere. Because you haven't been moving forward. You've been looping through the same structure without reaching an endpoint. And the longer that continues, the more convincing it becomes.
Because repetition creates familiarity. And familiarity creates the sense that something meaningful is happening, even when it isn't. So instead of recognizing it as a loop, your mind treats it like ongoing work. Something that still needs attention. Something that still needs to be figured out. But in reality, it's not asking for more thinking. It's stuck in a pattern that thinking alone doesn't resolve. And until that pattern is broken, the feeling of working through it will continue without anything actually changing.
What makes this difficult to notice is that it never stays in one place. It doesn't just remain as a thought. It spreads quietly into how you function. The first place it shows up is your focus. You can still work, you can still pay attention, but something about that attention becomes less stable. You drift more easily, you interrupt yourself more often. You're present, but not fully anchored. And so you start relying on effort just to maintain what used to happen automatically. Things that once felt smooth now require intention. Not because they became harder, but because your mind doesn't settle the same way anymore. When attention becomes unstable, information doesn't fully register. So you revisit things more than you should. Not from confusion, but from incomplete absorption. That adds quiet mental load. Then your energy begins to shift. Not as a sudden drop, but as reduced availability. You still have energy, just less of it accessible at once. So you adjust without noticing. You delay starting things, you pace yourself differently, you hesitate before beginning. Not out of avoidance, but because initiation now costs more. And once starting becomes heavier, everything spreads out. Tasks stretch. Gaps widen. You stop moving steadily and start moving in bursts. Start, stop, restart. And each restart costs more than it should, because nothing fully resets in between. Over time, this creates a subtle baseline shift. Not alarming, but noticeable in the background of everything you do. Then your mood changes, but not emotionally at first. Things feel less engaging, less absorbing. Even things you usually enjoy don't fully land anymore. Not because interest is gone, but because nothing is being fully experienced. Everything feels slightly incomplete. And incomplete experiences don't satisfy the same way, so a quiet restlessness builds. Not strong, but persistent. You move faster between things, switch earlier, search for something that feels engaging, but nothing fully does. Because the issue isn't what you're doing, it's the state you're bringing into it. Eventually, mental effort itself starts to feel heavier sooner before you begin. Not because tasks changed, but because your system is already loaded before you begin. So you reach fatigue faster, disengage earlier, and do less while feeling like you're doing more. And over time, this becomes your normal. Not because it is, but because you've adapted to it. And once something becomes your baseline, you stop questioning it. At this point, trying to think your way out of it usually doesn't work. Because the problem isn't lack of thinking, it's repetition of the same internal loop. So adding more thought doesn't break it,
It strengthens it. You stay inside the same pattern, just with more effort. And effort doesn't resolve this kind of cycle. It keeps it active. So the shift doesn't come from thinking harder. It comes from breaking continuity, stepping out of the loop instead of continuing it. Not by avoiding it, but by interrupting what keeps it running. Because a loop depends on stability. Same attention, same pattern, same internal conditions. Change those conditions, and the loop starts to lose structure. Not instantly, but enough to loosen its hold. And that separation is what allows reset to happen. Not by solving the thought, but by stopping engagement with it. In practice, this isn't mental, it's behavioral. Small interruptions in continuity, a change in position, a change in environment.
A deliberate redirection of attention, not passive, but active. Something that forces your mind into a different mode of processing. Because if the loop continues in the background, it's still alive. And if it's still alive, it returns the moment there's space. This is why distraction doesn't solve it. It only delays it. The goal isn't escape, it's withdrawal of fuel. Once the structure is interrupted long enough, something changes.
The cycle doesn't stop dramatically. It weakens. Re-entry becomes less automatic. The intensity drops. Gaps begin to form. And eventually, what kept returning starts to lose consistency. Not because it was solved, but because it's no longer sustained. That's the key difference. You're not fixing the loop. You're removing what keeps it running. And when that happens, your system starts to register something simple. It's no longer active. And that's when rest begins to feel like rest again.
Not because everything is clear, but because nothing is continuously pulling you back into itself. And even a brief break in that continuity is enough to change how it behaves going forward. Because once you recognize it, it stops being automatic. And what stops being automatic stops controlling you in the same way.